The night was colder than usual, and the streets were almost empty. Most people were inside their homes, keeping warm with family, food, and blankets. But for one young boy, there was no such comfort waiting. He walked slowly along the sidewalk, his hands deep inside his thin pockets, his head bent low against the biting wind. His jacket was too small for him, and his shoes were worn out. Every step felt heavy, not just because of the weather but also because of the emptiness in his stomach. He had not eaten properly in days, and the hunger made him weak. He had left his home earlier that week. Life at home was difficult, filled with arguments, disappointments, and a sense of being unwanted. At first, he thought he would only step outside for a little while to clear his head. But one night turned into two, then into three, and now he found himself wandering the streets with nowhere to go. He tried to keep strong, but he was just a teenager, and the world outside was not kind to someone his age with no money and no shelter. As he passed by the buildings, he noticed the warm lights shining through windows. Families were eating dinner together, laughing, and enjoying the night. He couldn't help but slow down to look, but it only deepened the ache inside him. He wanted that warmth, that comfort, but it seemed far away from his reality. For him, the streets were cold, and his only company was the sound of the wind and his growling stomach. He kept walking until he reached an old school building. The lights were still on, even though classes had ended hours ago. He saw a man inside, pushing a broom across the shiny floor of the hallway. The man was dressed in simple work clothes, and from the look of his movements, he had been at it for hours. The boy stood outside the glass door for a moment, watching silently. His breath fogged up the glass, and he quickly wiped it with his sleeve. He didn't know why he stopped there, but something made him pause. Maybe it was the warmth inside, or maybe it was the way the man worked quietly, not rushing, not complaining. The janitor, an older black man with kind but tired eyes, eventually noticed the boy standing outside. At first, he thought it was just a shadow, but when he looked closely, he saw the boy shivering. The janitor walked closer to the door, opened it slightly, and called out, "Hey, son, are you all right out there?" His voice was calm, not harsh, and it carried a gentle concern. The boy hesitated. He wanted to say yes, but the truth was written all over his face. His lips trembled from the cold, and his eyes showed a mixture of fear and exhaustion. The janitor stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. "It's too cold to be out there," he said. "Come on inside for a while." At first, the boy was unsure. He had been taught not to trust strangers too easily. But the man's voice was different. It didn't sound demanding, only caring. Slowly, he stepped inside. The warm air of the building touched his face, and it felt like stepping into another world. His fingers, stiff from the cold, began to loosen, and for the first time in hours, he felt a small sense of relief. The janitor led him to a chair near the hallway. He noticed how thin the boy was and how his clothes looked too old for him. "You hungry?" the man asked. The boy's eyes gave the answer before his mouth could. The janitor reached into his bag, pulled out a wrapped sandwich, and handed it to him. "It's not much, but it's something," he said. The boy took it slowly, almost as if he couldn't believe it was real. The first bite felt like life returning to him. He chewed carefully, trying not to finish it too fast, but his hunger made it hard to slow down. The janitor watched him with quiet patience, remembering what it felt like to be young and in need. As the boy ate, the janitor asked simple questions. "What's your name? Where are you from?" The boy answered in short sentences, not giving away too much, but enough for the man to understand that he was out here alone. The janitor didn't press him too hard. He knew that trust was not built in one moment. Instead, he just sat nearby, continuing his work while keeping an eye on the boy. The night grew quieter as time passed. The boy leaned back in the chair, feeling a warmth not only from the building but also from the presence of someone who cared enough to notice him. It wasn't just the sandwich or the shelter, it was the kindness in the janitor's actions that made the biggest difference. For days, the boy had felt invisible, like no one cared if he existed. But tonight, someone did. The janitor returned with a spare blanket he kept in the closet. He handed it to the boy and said, "You can rest here for a while. No one will bother you." The boy wrapped it around himself tightly. The fabric was rough, but to him, it felt softer than anything he had touched in weeks. He felt safe enough to close his eyes, something he hadn't done in days, without fear of being woken by cold or danger. The janitor continued his work, sweeping the floors, emptying the trash, and checking the classrooms. But every now and then, he glanced at the boy to make sure he was all right. He thought about how many people had probably walked past this child without stopping. He couldn't imagine leaving him outside on such a night. It was a simple choice for him: human decency, compassion. Hours later, when his shift ended, he gently tapped the boy on the shoulder. "I'm done here. You can stay until morning, but then we'll have to figure something out," he said softly. The boy nodded, still half asleep but deeply grateful. He whispered a thank you, his voice weak but sincere. As the janitor walked out of the building, he couldn't shake the thought that this boy needed more than just one night of shelter. Something inside him told him that this meeting wasn't by chance. It was the beginning of something important, something that might shape both of their lives in ways neither of them could imagine at that moment. The boy, wrapped in the blanket and full for the first time in days, closed his eyes again. For once, he felt a little less alone in the world. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, kindness had found him. And that made all the difference. The morning light slowly crept through the tall windows of the school building. The boy stirred under the blanket, blinking his tired eyes as he adjusted to the brightness. For a moment, he forgot where he was. He thought he might still be outside in the cold, but then he remembered the warmth, the food, and the kindness of the janitor. The thought made him sit up straighter. He looked around the quiet hallway, where everything was neatly arranged, the floors shining from the man's hard work the night before. The boy folded the blanket carefully, not wanting to seem careless with something that had been given to him. He was about to leave when the door creaked open. The janitor walked in with a small bag in his hand. He smiled when he saw the boy awake. "Morning, son. I brought you something," he said, placing the bag on the chair. Inside were 2 bread rolls, a piece of fruit, and a small carton of milk. The boy's eyes widened. He wasn't used to anyone bringing him food. "Eat up," the janitor encouraged, sitting down nearby. The boy hesitated for a moment, then picked up the roll and took a bite. It was soft and fresh, and the sweetness of the fruit made him feel alive again. As he ate, the janitor asked gently, "So, what's your story?" The boy looked down at his hands. He wasn't sure how much he should share. He didn't want pity, and he didn't want to feel judged. But there was something about the man's eyes that told him he could be honest. Slowly, he began to speak. He explained that home had become too hard for him. There were constant fights, and he felt like no one wanted him around. He had tried to manage on his own, but hunger and loneliness had taken over. His voice cracked as he spoke, but the janitor listened quietly, without interrupting, without frowning. When the boy finished, the janitor leaned back and nodded. "Life isn't easy, especially when you're young and on your own," he said thoughtfully. "But you're not alone anymore, son. Not while I'm here." The words hit the boy's heart like a warm fire. It wasn't just food or a blanket this time, it was hope, and hope was something he had almost forgotten about. The janitor introduced himself properly. His name was Mr. Lewis. He had been working at the school for many years, quietly cleaning classrooms, fixing broken things, and making sure the students had a safe place to learn. Most people passed by him without noticing, but he didn't mind. He found peace in his work and pride in keeping the school clean. Now, he found something more, someone who needed him. The boy asked why Mr. Lewis had helped him. Most people had just walked past, pretending not to see. Mr. Lewis smiled gently and said, "Because I know what it feels like to be forgotten. And I promised myself long ago that if I ever saw someone in need, I wouldn't turn my back. We can't fix everything in the world, but we can do our part." Those words stayed with the boy. No one had ever spoken to him that way before. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he mattered. That day, Mr. Lewis let him stay close while he worked. The boy watched as he swept the hallways, wiped down desks, and repaired little things that students often broke. At first, the boy felt awkward just sitting there, but then he asked if he could help. Mr. Lewis handed him a small broom, and together they cleaned. It wasn't much, but it gave the boy a sense of purpose. He realized that work, even simple work, could bring pride when done with care. Later in the afternoon, as the students filled the classrooms, the boy stayed out of sight. He didn't want questions or attention. Mr. Lewis noticed and didn't push him. Instead, he quietly made sure the boy had something to eat and a safe place to rest until evening came again. This became a routine. The boy would show up when the school was quieter, and Mr. Lewis would welcome him. Each night, he shared stories about life. He told the boy about his own struggles growing up, about the times when he had little but still kept moving forward. He talked about honesty, hard work, and faith in better days. These were not lessons from a book, they were lessons from experience, spoken with sincerity. The boy listened carefully, absorbing every word. He began to realize that strength was not about fighting the world but about standing firm, even when life tried to knock you down. He admired how Mr. Lewis never complained about his job, even though it was hard and often thankless. Instead, he took pride in doing it well. That attitude began to shape the boy's thoughts. One evening, after finishing his sandwich, the boy asked shyly, "Why do you care about me when you don't even know me?" Mr. Lewis looked at him and said, "Because someone cared for me once when I needed it. That's how the world should work. We pass kindness forward." The boy thought about that all night. He realized that one small act could change the course of someone's life. Days turned into weeks, and though the boy didn't have a permanent home yet, he found a safe space in the school building with Mr. Lewis. He began to trust him more and even shared his dreams. He admitted that he wanted to go back to school but felt too far behind. Mr. Lewis encouraged him. "It's never too late. Education is your ticket to a better life. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise," he said firmly. That advice struck deeply. For the first time, the boy began to see a future beyond survival. He started to imagine himself not just as a lost teenager but as someone who could build something better. He didn't know how it would happen yet, but the seed was planted. What made the biggest difference was that Mr. Lewis never treated him like a burden. He never made him feel small or unworthy. Instead, he showed him patience and respect. When the boy made mistakes, he guided him gently. When the boy doubted himself, he reminded him of his potential. Slowly, the boy's heart began to heal from the pain of rejection and neglect. Each night they spent together created a bond that was stronger than either of them expected. The boy began to see Mr. Lewis as more than just a janitor. He became a father figure, a mentor, and a friend. And Mr. Lewis saw the boy not just as a troubled teenager but as a soul full of promise, waiting for the right guidance. The world outside was still harsh. The boy still faced cold nights, hunger, and uncertainty about where he would sleep after the school closed. But the difference now was that he had someone who cared, someone who reminded him that his story wasn't finished yet. The kindness of one man had given him a reason to believe again. And though neither of them knew it yet, this simple connection, born out of compassion on a cold night, would grow into something far greater than they could have imagined. What began as an act of kindness was slowly turning into the foundation of a remarkable journey that would one day inspire an entire community. The days slowly turned into months, and the boy's life began to change in quiet but meaningful ways. He was still young, still uncertain about the future, but every moment he spent with Mr. Lewis gave him something he had been missing for years: guidance. The janitor never made big promises, never painted dreams with bright colors. Instead, he spoke about life in a steady, simple way, reminding the boy that discipline and patience were as important as dreams. The boy began to think about school again. He remembered how he once liked to learn, especially reading stories and solving small math problems. But since leaving home, he had fallen behind. He was ashamed to go back, afraid that other kids would laugh at him. One night, as he sat quietly in the hallway, he told Mr. Lewis his worries. "What if they make fun of me? What if I can't catch up?" he asked softly. Mr. Lewis smiled, leaning on his broom. "Son, don't let fear decide your future. Everyone starts somewhere. If you're willing to work hard, nothing can stop you. The only thing that can truly hold you back is giving up." The words sank into the boy's heart. They were not said with force but with truth. With Mr. Lewis's encouragement, the boy found the courage to return to school. It wasn't easy. On his first day back, he sat at the back of the classroom, trying to avoid attention. His clothes were still old, and he didn't have fancy supplies like the other students. But he carried something far more powerful inside him: the determination to try. The first few weeks were hard. He struggled with lessons that others seemed to understand quickly. Sometimes he felt frustrated, even embarrassed. But every evening, when he felt like giving up, he would remember the janitor's words. Discipline. Patience. Don't give up. Those words became his anchor. Mr. Lewis also helped in small ways. He couldn't afford much, but he gave the boy pencils, notebooks, and sometimes even stayed late after his shift to quiz him on spelling words or math problems. The boy would sit at a desk while Mr. Lewis swept around him, answering questions in between strokes of the broom. It was not a formal classroom, but it was enough. And slowly, the boy began to improve. Beyond academics, the boy learned life lessons. Mr. Lewis often reminded him that respect was not about titles or money, but about how you treated others. He said, "Even if you become the most important man in town, remember the people who helped you when you had nothing. Don't forget them." Those words stayed with the boy like a quiet promise he made in his heart. Still, life outside school remained tough. There were nights when he had no proper place to sleep, nights when his stomach growled from hunger. Sometimes he felt the cold wind again, reminding him of the streets he once wandered alone. But he wasn't truly alone anymore. Whenever things became unbearable, he knew he could go back to the school building, find Mr. Lewis, and receive comfort in the form of a meal, a blanket, or simply a listening ear. One evening, after a particularly hard day, the boy broke down. He sat on the floor, covering his face with his hands, tears falling silently. He was tired of being poor, tired of feeling like he had to fight for every small thing. Mr. Lewis found him there and sat beside him. He didn't scold or tell him to stop crying. Instead, he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "Crying doesn't make you weak, son. It makes you human. But once the tears dry, you stand up again. That's what strength really is." The boy wiped his eyes and nodded. That night became a turning point. He promised himself that no matter how many times life pushed him down, he would always stand up again. In time, the boy started to dream bigger. He looked at the leaders in his town, the teachers, the principal, the people in office, and wondered if he could one day be like them. He didn't tell anyone about these thoughts at first, but the spark was there. He wanted to do more than survive, he wanted to make a difference. It wasn't only about himself. The kindness of one man had shown him how powerful compassion could be. He thought about all the other kids out there who might be hungry, lost, or forgotten. He thought about how many walked the streets at night like he once had, invisible to the world. He wanted to change that. He wanted to give others the same chance he had been given. This new fire inside him made him work harder at school. He stayed up late reading books, asking questions, and practicing until he understood. Teachers began to notice his effort. Some praised him, others offered extra help. Slowly, he stopped being the boy at the back of the class and became the boy who raised his hand with answers. His classmates began to respect him, not because of his clothes or background, but because of his determination. Mr. Lewis watched all this quietly with pride. He didn't boast about his part in the boy's journey. He simply continued to encourage him, always reminding him to stay humble. Remember, he often said, true greatness isn't about standing above others, but about lifting them up with you. The boy also began helping Mr. Lewis more. He cleaned classrooms, carried trash bags, and even polished the floors. It wasn't glamorous work, but he did it with the same pride Mr. Lewis showed. Through these small acts, he learned responsibility and the dignity of labor. He understood that no job was beneath him if it was done with honesty. Years passed this way, each day shaping the boy a little more. His body grew stronger, his mind sharper, and his heart fuller. He still faced challenges, sometimes hunger, sometimes loneliness, but now he carried with him the lessons of resilience. Every difficulty became fuel for his growth. The bond between him and Mr. Lewis grew deeper too. They were no longer just a boy and a janitor. They were family in the truest sense of the word, not connected by blood, but by love, trust, and shared struggle. One night, as they sat together after finishing the cleaning, the boy looked at Mr. Lewis and said, "One day, I'm going to make you proud. I don't know how, but I promise you that your kindness won't be wasted." Mr. Lewis chuckled softly, patting his shoulder. "You already make me proud, son. Every time you try, every time you get back up, you make me proud." The boy smiled, but inside he made a silent vow. He knew that his journey was just beginning. He knew that life would test him many more times. But he also knew that with determination, and with the lessons he had learned from Mr. Lewis, he could go much further than anyone expected. What he didn't know yet was just how far he would go. One day, the hungry boy who had once wandered the cold streets would rise to become a leader. And when that day came, he would carry with him the memory of the man who had saved him, not with riches, but with kindness. The years continued to pass, and the boy slowly grew into a young man. He was no longer the thin, frightened teenager who had once stood outside the school door on a freezing night. He had grown taller, stronger, and more confident. His clothes were still simple, his life still modest, but something about him had changed. He carried himself with determination. He spoke with clarity and kindness, and people had begun to notice. At school, he kept pushing himself harder. What started as small steps, learning to read better, solving math problems, standing up to answer questions, turned into bigger achievements. He became one of the brightest students in his class, not because things came easy to him, but because he refused to give up. Teachers admired his persistence. Some even wondered how a boy who had started with so little could rise so quickly. But he knew the answer. It was because someone believed in him when no one else did. Even with his studies improving, life outside school was not smooth. There were still days when he went hungry, nights when he had no proper bed, and moments when loneliness returned to remind him of his past. But unlike before, these struggles no longer broke him. He carried with him the strength he had built and the lessons from Mr. Lewis. Every hardship became fuel for his dreams. As he entered his teenage years, he started thinking more deeply about his future. He often told himself that he didn't just want to escape poverty, he wanted to create change. He had seen too many kids like himself, wandering the streets, invisible to the world. He knew the pain of being forgotten, and he didn't want others to go through the same. A spark began to grow inside him. He wanted to serve people, to stand up for them, and to make life better for those who had little. Mr. Lewis noticed this fire in him. Sometimes, when they sat together after finishing the cleaning work, the boy would talk about his dreams. "Maybe I could be a teacher, or maybe even help run the school one day," he would say, his eyes shining with hope. Mr. Lewis would listen carefully and nod. "You can be anything, son. But remember, whatever you become, do it with honesty and heart. That's what truly matters." As he finished school, the young man began to look for bigger opportunities. He applied for scholarships and worked part-time jobs to pay for his studies. It wasn't easy. Many doors closed on him, and many people doubted him. But each time, he thought about the freezing night when he almost gave up, and the warm hand that reached out to save him. That memory pushed him forward. Eventually, he managed to go to college. It was a new world for him, filled with challenges and new faces. At first, he felt out of place among students who came from wealthy families and had everything he once wished for. But he didn't let it discourage him. Instead, he worked twice as hard. He studied late into the night, often with little food, but with unshakable determination. Slowly, professors began to notice his commitment, and classmates began to respect his intelligence and kindness. College also gave him the chance to learn about leadership. He joined student groups, volunteered for community projects, and began to speak out about issues that mattered. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but his words carried weight because they came from lived experience. People listened when he spoke, not because of fancy language but because of the sincerity in his heart. One day, after giving a small speech about helping underprivileged children, someone approached him and said, "You should think about going into public service. We need leaders like you." At first, he laughed it off, thinking it was too big of a dream. But deep inside, he felt a stirring. Could he really become a leader? Could he really stand in a position to change lives on a larger scale? He shared this thought with Mr. Lewis during one of their late-night talks. The old janitor chuckled and said, "Why not? Leaders don't come from perfect homes or easy lives. Real leaders are those who know the struggles of the people. You've lived through them. You know what it means to be hungry, to be cold, to be unseen. That makes you stronger than you realize." Those words stayed in his heart and began to shape his vision of the future. After college, he didn't choose an easy path. Instead of running after money, he worked in community programs, helping children, supporting families, and speaking for those who had no voice. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't bring wealth, but it brought him purpose. He remembered the kindness he had once received and wanted to pass it forward in bigger ways. As the years passed, his reputation grew. People saw him not just as a young man with ideas but as someone who truly cared. He listened when others spoke, he worked hard without complaint, and he carried himself with humility. Slowly, community leaders began to notice. Soon, he was invited to meetings, asked for advice, and trusted with responsibilities. The idea of becoming a public leader, once only a dream, began to take shape. When people suggested he should run for mayor, he hesitated at first. It felt like too big a step, too heavy a responsibility. But then he thought about his journey: the cold night on the street, the warm building, the sandwich, the blanket, the guidance of a man who believed in him. If he could rise from that place of despair to where he stood now, maybe he could go even further. Maybe he could use his life to inspire others and to prove that no one is too broken to rise. When he finally decided to run for mayor, it wasn't for power or recognition. It was because he wanted to serve. His campaign was simple. He didn't have much money, he didn't have powerful connections, but he had honesty, hard work, and the trust of the people he had already helped. He walked door to door, meeting families, listening to their problems, and sharing his vision. Some people doubted him. They thought a boy from the streets could never win against experienced politicians. But others saw his sincerity and were moved by his story. Slowly, support began to grow. People admired that he was one of them, someone who had lived their struggles and still stood tall. Throughout the campaign, he never forgot the man who had saved him. Mr. Lewis, now older and slower, watched proudly from the sidelines. He often reminded him, "Stay humble, son. Win or lose, remember why you started." When election day finally came, the young man felt both nervous and hopeful. He wasn't sure if the people would choose him, but he knew he had given everything he had. And when the results were announced, the town erupted in surprise and joy. Against all odds, the once hungry boy had won. He had become the mayor of the very town where he had once been invisible. As he stood before the cheering crowd, he couldn't help but think back to the freezing night that had changed his life. It was not luck or chance that brought him here, it was kindness, hard work, and the belief of one man who saw value in him when no one else did. And deep in his heart, he knew this was only the beginning. His journey had brought him from despair to leadership, and now it was his turn to use that position to create change, to lift others, and to show the world that even the smallest act of kindness could shape the future of an entire community. The day of the mayor's swearing-in was filled with excitement. The town hall had never been so alive. People crowded outside, waving small flags, smiling, and talking about the young man who had surprised everyone by winning the election. For many, it was more than just a political victory, it was a symbol of hope. He was living proof that no matter where someone started, they could rise with determination and kindness. Inside the hall, the air buzzed with anticipation. Reporters set up cameras, community members filled the seats, and leaders from nearby towns came to witness the ceremony. Everyone waited to see how the boy who had once been forgotten on the streets would now step forward as the mayor. But in the front row sat one man who wasn't just watching history, he was part of it. Mr. Lewis, the old janitor, sat quietly with his hands folded, his eyes filled with pride. His clothes were simple, his back slightly bent with age, but he shone brighter than anyone else in the room. For him, this was more than a political event. It was the moment he saw the boy he once took in, the boy he once fed and guided, stand tall as a leader. When the mayor-to-be entered the hall, the crowd cheered. He walked slowly, his heart racing, but his eyes searched immediately for one face. When he saw Mr. Lewis sitting in the front, his chest swelled with emotion. He had invited him personally, insisting that he sit at the place of honor. Without that man, none of this would have been possible. The ceremony began with formal speeches and introductions, but when it was time for him to take the oath, the room fell silent. He raised his right hand, repeated the words carefully, and with that, he officially became the mayor. The crowd clapped, cheered, and some even wiped away tears. But for him, the greatest joy was yet to come. As he stepped up to the podium to give his first speech, he paused for a long moment. The weight of his journey pressed on his heart. He looked at the faces before him, the people who believed in him, the teachers who had guided him, and above all, the man who had saved him. His voice trembled slightly as he began to speak. "I stand before you today as your mayor, but before I was this, I was just a hungry boy on a cold night. I was lost, I was alone, and I felt invisible. But on that night, one man opened a door for me. He gave me food when I was starving, warmth when I was freezing, and hope when I had none. That man is sitting here today. His name is Mr. Lewis." The crowd turned toward the old janitor, who looked surprised and shy. Some people clapped, others gasped, and many smiled warmly. Tears filled Mr. Lewis's eyes as he bowed his head slightly. He had never wanted recognition. He had only done what he thought was right. But in that moment, the whole town recognized him as the true hero of the story. The mayor continued, his voice stronger now. I am here today because of him. He taught me that greatness is not about power, money, or fame. It is about kindness, about lifting others when they are down. His small act of compassion changed my life, and because of that, I want to dedicate my service as mayor to building a community where no one is left hungry, no one is left out in the cold, and no one is made to feel invisible. The room erupted with applause. People stood on their feet, clapping louder than before. It wasn't just a political speech, it was a story of humanity, of how a simple act could ripple across decades and change an entire community. After the ceremony, many came to congratulate the new mayor, but he walked straight to Mr. Lewis first. He bent slightly, hugged him tightly, and whispered, "I owe everything to you." The old man patted his back and replied with a trembling smile, "You owe me nothing, son. You did this yourself. I only gave you a little push. The rest was your heart." The two stood together, side by side, and for many in the crowd, that image said more than any speech. It showed the true meaning of leadership, not standing above others, but remembering those who lifted you when you were low. In the months that followed, the mayor began his work. True to his promise, he focused on helping the people who needed it most. He started programs to provide meals for hungry children, shelters for those without homes, and scholarships for students who couldn't afford education. He worked long hours, not for fame but for the genuine desire to make life better for his community. People admired his humility. He didn't hide his past or pretend it hadn't happened. Instead, he used it as proof that anyone could rise, no matter how hopeless things seemed. He often visited schools and told his story to students. He reminded them that education, hard work, and kindness could open doors to a brighter future. His words inspired countless young people who once felt forgotten. And through it all, Mr. Lewis remained by his side. The mayor often invited him to events, not as a worker but as a guest of honor. The town, which had once passed by the janitor without noticing, now respected him deeply. They saw him as a man whose quiet compassion had shaped the destiny of their leader and, in turn, the destiny of the whole town. As years went by, their bond only grew stronger. The mayor never missed a chance to thank Mr. Lewis, not just privately but publicly. Whenever he spoke about his journey, he always said, "I am proof that one person's kindness can change the world." And every time he said those words, he would look at Mr. Lewis with gratitude. The mayor's story spread far beyond the town. Newspapers wrote about him, television shows featured his journey, and people across the country admired how he had risen from the streets to leadership. But whenever reporters asked him about his success, his answer was always the same: it started with a janitor who chose kindness. Mr. Lewis lived to see the boy he once saved become not only a mayor but also a symbol of hope for thousands. He lived to see the world finally notice that even the simplest man, doing the simplest job, could have the greatest impact. And in his heart, he felt peace knowing that his act of compassion had not just saved a life but had changed history. Years later, as the mayor grew older and his time in office came to an end, he often reflected on his journey. He knew that titles and positions were temporary, but the lessons of kindness lasted forever. He had built schools, improved roads, and created programs, but his proudest achievement was carrying forward the spirit of compassion he had once received. And whenever he passed by the old school building, he would stop for a moment. He would remember the boy who once stood outside shivering, the janitor who opened the door, and the life that had changed forever because of that single choice. His story reminded everyone that greatness does not come from where you start, but from how you rise, and from the kindness you give and receive along the way.